Revelation chapter 2 is where we're going to be today. We're continuing our look at the seven churches and seeing how God corrected them, and so that we could see how He might be correcting us in the same way. But before we get into it, there's a few things that a few people I want to recognize. The first is, it is good to see Butch here today. We're excited you're here, brother. And man, I know that you're not seeking any of this, but man, I just want to say, and you probably don't even want me to say anything. Amen. Okay, well, it doesn't matter. I have the mic. And so anyway, like one of the things that I often see with just in leaders is you really don't know the effect that they have until they leave. And Butch, it's been an honor to see like Living Hope go through this transition so well. And so, man, that really speaks to you, your leadership, your family. And so, man, thanks for serving here for over 20 years, and being faithful here. And so, anyway, man, just excited to see what Living Hope's going to do in the future. But a lot of that's, man, a vision that God gave you over 20 years ago. And so, anyway, man, just really glad you're here. I'm glad that how God's using you. Second, I've got some family here today, just so that I can introduce them. My sister and brother-in-law are right here, and believe it or not, at one point I was an introvert. I didn't speak very well. I know that's hard for you to believe. Until about middle school, I think it was middle school, I was crying about something. I was a little emotional as a kid, as a lad, and she bear hugged me down to the ground when she could still do that, and then saying 99 bottles of Coke on the wall before I got to 8. There was 8 Cokes left on the wall until I said what was wrong. And so anyway, she kind of opened up my ability to speak, especially speak in front of people. So God used you, Raya, in a unique way. And then my parents are here, my mom and dad, and so excited to have them. One of the things. My mom is Greek, and so I have a little bit of that blood in me. I like to throw dishes on the ground and yell "Opa" all the time, and use Windex on things. Anyway, just kidding. That's not a Greek thing. But they shaped me. Like God used them to shape me in a unique way, and so I'm excited to have them there. And one of the things, especially that my dad was really gifted at. Was teaching me stories or teaching me life lessons in analogies. Or he would pull me aside, we would do something together, but while we were doing together, we were just having conversations about life. So I knew that when my dad came home and said, "Hey son, let's throw the baseball," that could mean one of two things. It could mean one, hey, we just need to get better at baseball. I want to throw the ball with you. Or two, it means, hey, son, we need to throw the baseball because there's some correction that's about to come in the middle of this conversation. And so there was many times my dad would come home and he would say, "Son, let's throw the baseball." And what was unique about it is I could always tell in the introduction what type of scenario I was getting myself into. I could always tell if it was, "Hey, son, let's throw the baseball," it was hey, we're just going to go throw the baseball, spend some time together, and just have a good conversation. But then when it was, "Son, hey, get your glove, we need to throw the baseball," I knew there was some correcting that was about to happen. So I remember one day getting sent to the principal's office because I pulled on a kid's chain and made him bleed. Not on purpose, it was just what little boys do at the time. And I remember getting sent to the principal's office and my dad coming home and saying, "Hey son, let's throw the baseball." And the glare was not so much we're going to get better at baseball right now as it is there's some correction that has to happen in your life. And the reason I say that is because the introduction for the church in Pergamum is not like any other introduction that we've seen so far with the seven churches. Like you look at the church at Ephesus in the introduction in chapter 2, verse 1, and it says this: "The words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands." It's this picture of God being in control, God having this power. And then chapter 2, verse 8, look at the introduction. It says, "And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last, who died and came to life." It's this encouraging sort of introduction. Hey, let me tell you about God. He was the first and he was the last. And not only that, he died and he came to life again. And so this is encouraging sort of moment. But look at chapter 2, verse 12. It says, "And to the angel of the church in Pergamum write, the words of him who has the sharp, two-edged sword." It's like I'm sitting in my room again and my dad's saying, "Hey, it's time to go throw the baseball." And you could tell immediately that there is some stuff that's going to be talked about here. You see in the introduction from the very beginning that it's different than any other church we've seen. And it's this picture of God coming down as a righteous judge. As a righteous judge. The only other time, or another time that in Revelation where God is having this sword, or Jesus is having this sword, is actually in Revelation 19:15. It says this, "From God's mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron." It's a picture of God coming in and bringing a fierce correction to his church, to his people. Now, so often when we come to a message like this, it's really easy for us to contextualize our life and begin to think, hey, you know what? I wish that so-and-so was here. Or I wish my coworker is here because they need some correction. Like they need God to really get a hold of their life. And so in moments where we tend to have this type of introduction, then we tend to kind of pull back a little bit from the text. But what I'm really asking you today is to think about is if we could just get anyone else's picture, anyone else's life, or anyone else's face out of our mind, and rather approach this text not with the word them, they, you, but rather approach this text from the word I. That God has some correction for us today. That God has something that he spoke to his church in Pergamum, but he has preserved that message through the ages, and he is now teaching it to us. And here's the message. Verse 13. He says, "I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. Yet you hold fast to my name, and you did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells." So this picture at first in Pergamum is actually pretty unique because the city of Pergamum was a wealthy city. The city had a library. The city had a library that wasn't just like a normal library, but it was one that rivaled the library that was in Alexandria. So it was a city that was well known, well educated, and had wealth in the middle of it. And so like Jesus says, hey, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. Now, he could say this for multiple reasons, and scholars don't agree all on why Jesus would say where Satan's throne dwells, but it could be multiple things. Number one, Pergamum was known as a city of emperor worship, as a city that viewed their leaders as godlike figures. It could be that this city was known for having lots of different temples in the city. All these different gods in the middle of it, and so that's why I could say that. Or large statues, or just like a morally corrupt city. But he starts off encouraging them. And he says, hey, I know where Satan's throne dwells, and it's right here in the middle of your midst, yet you have stood against them. You have stood against all the other moral authorities that have come to you, and you have stood up in the public square for my name, for my glory, for my name's sake. And not only that, when your friend Antipas, when he was killed and for his faith, when he was martyred, hey, not only then, but you stood up. And so these guys were a group of people that stood strong. They had boldness, they had perseverance. Even when their friends were dying, they weren't backing down. He says this in verse 14, "But I have a few things against you. You have some there who hold the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, so they might eat food sacrificed to idols and practice sexual immorality. So also you have some who hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans." Now, we've got to dive in a little bit here because those two people, Balak or Balaam and the Nicolaitans, are significant. We see in Numbers 22 Balaam for the first time. And here's what it says. He was an Old Testament false prophet who would often be hired so that he could bring moral corruption to a certain group of people. That was his role, Numbers 22 through Numbers 25. And we see that Balak, the king of Moab, hired Balaam to try to infiltrate and move away the Israelites from worshiping God. And so Balaam tried three times to get the people of God, as they were going through the promised land, conquering city after city after city, he tried three times to direct their attention somewhere else and curse them. But God intervened three times. So then what's fascinating though, right here, Balaam, as he's talking to Balak, says, hey, instead of trying to curse them, let's just entice them. And he goes, let's entice them to do two things. The first, let's entice them to eat meat sacrificed to idols, which was a thing that God spoke directly against as they were going into the promised land for them not to do. And then the second thing that Balaam told Balak to do was to entice them with the women of Moab. And so we see, as the Israelite people are going through the promised land, seeing God do multiple things over and over and over again, that they begin to direct their gaze away from the Lord and to these Moabite women and food sacrificed to idols. And so we see the people of God holding fast in the promise of God, but then directing their attention somewhere else. Now, the other person that's mentioned right here is the Nicolaitans. And what's interesting about the Nicolaitans is we first run into Nicholas in Acts chapter 6. You see, in Acts chapter 2, the church is growing. The church blows up. It has about, 150 people that day. And then Acts chapter 2, Pentecost comes. And then Peter preaches to a group of people, and 3,000 of them are saved at one moment. Boom, 3,000 people. So the church went from like 150 to 3,150 in one day. And I don't know about that type of astronomical growth, but I know that it brings lots of problems. The prophet, or the apostles, as they were leading the church, were now having to divert their attention from all sorts of things, from the apostles' teaching and prayer, to all sorts of just running the church. Widows weren't being fed correctly. Money wasn't given to the right people. They had just all the logistics of gathering thousands of people together. And so these apostles were just struggling day to day, probably working 20 hours a day, just trying to work in the church, but never working on the church. And so in Acts chapter 6, they nominate some deacons. And the church has never been the same since. But that was a joke. And so the disciples get together. And they look for people that have high standing, that are walking well with the Lord, that are thought of well amongst the people. And here's the list. Stephen. Stephen was a man who was later martyred for his faith. Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and listen to this last name, Nicholas. So Nicholas was one of the seven. I mean, he was the guy chosen out of 3,000 to serve, to hold a leadership position in the church. Now, that's the only time we hear about Nicholas in the early church until Revelation, where it says, Revelation 2:6 says, yet this you have, you hate the work of the Nicolaitans. Then, from our text for today, Revelation 2, verse 15, so also some of you hold fast to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. So we have this guy who was once winning people for the Lord, sipping cappuccinos with Paul as he did his missionary journeys. And then now we hear of Nicholas starting a teaching that leads people away from the Lord. And what's fascinating is we don't really understand, like the Bible doesn't go into any depth about what the teaching of the Nicolaitans was, but we do see some early church fathers speaking against the Nicolaitans. And so Irenaeus says this, they live lives, speaking about the Nicolaitans, they live lives of unrestrained indulgence. Clement of Alexandria said the Nicolaitans abandoned themselves to pleasure like goats, leading a life of self-indulgence. And so if you take the teaching of Balaam, which is people that are walking with the Lord, that move their eyes and indulge themselves inside immorality, inside just any principle away from the Lord, that's Balaam. And then you have the Nicolaitans, the teaching of Nicholas, which does the same thing where there's this full, unrestrained indulgence. You begin to get a picture of what's happening inside the church at Pergamum. And the picture is this. A group of people who in the public square are standing up for the gospel, but inside their private lives, they have turned away from the Lord and have submitted themselves to sin. Like, do you hear that? These people were inside the public square dying for their faith, yet at the same time living sexually immoral lives, not managing their money the way God called them to, and their attention was away from the Lord. So this should open up our mind really big, or at least it did to me, that even in the middle of our standing for the gospel, privately our lives can still be so far away from God. You hear that? That no matter what we look on the outside, our heart can still be in full rebellion against God. And so we cannot, a little side note here, we can't judge people with what they look like on the outside. When God looks at us, He doesn't say, oh, George, good job, you're the interim pastor at Living Hope. No, God instead says, hey, George, I've seen your heart, and there's either pleasing to me or it's not. And so we have to enlarge our idea of sin. We have to enlarge our idea of what being a Christian looks like. You see, because God is very uninterested in what we look like in public. How many times did God go to the Pharisees and they're sitting there on the street corner and they're praying and they're doing all these things, yet at the same time calling them a brood of vipers? Yet at the same time calling them people that to lead their people astray. You see, God has very little interest in what we look like on the outside, and He's very interested in what our heart looks like towards Him. And we can have our life together in such a way where we look right, we're dressed right, we say all the right things, but our heart is so far away from God that He doesn't even know us. And that's what's happening at the church in Pergamum. That's what's happening. And you know what I've found? I've just found that when the people of God try to look right on the outside, yet their heart is far away from the Lord, they end up doing more damage for God's name. When I was my first full-time ministry position, I was in Denver, Colorado. And before I got there, the former pastor that was there before the pastor that I was working with, he was a man who was well-spoken. Man could take the word of God and divide it well. And the church was growing, about to start a building campaign, and then it came out that he had 4 affairs with ladies in the church. 4 affairs. Overnight, that church lost 50% of their members. 50%. Then, not only that, it put itself on a trajectory where the church would just struggle and struggle and struggle for the next 5 years. And really, even to this day, a church that was once a light in Green Mountain in Lakewood, Colorado, is now this church that's kind of casually doing things. And it all started with a man who looked good on the outside. But on the inside, his heart was far away from God. And he allowed sin to come in. You know, I've been in ministry. I was calculating it this week. I've been in ministry for a little under 20 years. My first work inside of the church was when I was 18 years old as a youth intern. And over 20 years, I've seen lots of things. I've seen students that have struggled with cutting, students that have struggled with depression, students that have struggled with sexual morality or pornography. I've seen students that struggle with fame and really worrying about what other people think of them. I've also seen dads who've made work their idol. I've seen parents and families torn apart by affairs. I've seen all these things, and what was fascinating to me is like really early on in ministry, I was surprised when a student would come to me and say, hey, look, I'm really struggling with X, Y, and Z. I'm struggling with pornography, or I'm struggling with sleeping with my boyfriend or girlfriend, or I'm struggling. And then other times when I would see students come in, I would think, oh, well, I knew they were struggling with pornography. It was just really obvious. But then there were other times when I would see a family get divorced because of affairs, and it would rock me to the core because I never expected that from them. And so early on in ministry, it was this weird like roller coaster of like, how could that happen? How did I miss it? All these things. And it became this thing where now I realize that any of us are capable of anything at any time. Any of us are capable of succumbing ourselves to the enemy. You see, the enemy is good. Like John 10:10 says, the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. In Genesis chapter 4, we see as Cain and Abel, as Abel gave a bad offering to the Lord, God tells Abel, he says this, sin is crouching at your door. Its desire is to have you, but you must rule over it. You see, you and I right now are in the middle of a gigantic spiritual war. We are. The enemy is out lurking around and is ready to discredit us or is ready to ruin our life. And he begins to flash little things into us. Little things that we go after. Hey, wouldn't it be great if you did this? Hey, this is really not that big a deal. Just let it in. And what the enemy is so crafty at is taking one step at a time. We've talked about this before. And when we allow ourselves to take one step, then the next step is even easier. And so I begin to ask myself, like, how do I know, like, how can I evaluate myself and my heart and see if I'm where God needs me and God wants me to be? You see, like, imagine it like this. Imagine I've been asked to do a blind test on whether or not you're following the Lord. And the all that I have, I don't have anything that you have on the outside, but what I have is this. I have reports about your conversations. I have reports about your internet activity, the way you dress, like your playlist that you listen to, your television habits, your hobbies, what you do in your leisure time. I have your financial transactions, your thoughts, your dreams. Would I be able to see, based on that alone, a life who is submitted to the Lord? Would I be able to see that? Nothing on the outside, but everything on the inside. Joel Beek has a quote. He's a writer, and he says this: the goal of worldly people is to move forward rather than upward, to live horizontally rather than vertically. They seek after outward prosperity rather than holiness. They burst with selfish desires rather than heartfelt supplications. If they do not deny God, they ignore and forget Him. Or else they use Him only for their selfish ends. You see, worldliness is human nature without God. And I just wonder where some of us are. I just wonder if we look at the church of Pergamum and we see, hey, you know what? What's happening at that church is actually happening in me. It's happening in us. And so how can you evaluate that if that's true of you? Here are some questions that I think are good to ask. Number one, who or what dominates your mind and stirs your heart? What gets you really excited? Is it the Lord and His plan for you? Or is it acquiring something? Number two, what areas of discontentment are in your life? What areas of discontentment are in your life? Does that dominate your heart? Or do longings for earthly pleasures dominate your heart? Number four, does outward prosperity appeal to you more than growth in godliness? When you're sitting alone in the darkness of your soul, in the dark nights of the soul, as one writer says, what dominates your thoughts at that point? Is it the Powerball? Or is it growing in godliness and seeing how God sees you? Think about how God sees you. Is your prayer life characterized by heartfelt supplications for God's will to be done? Or for just what you want? Or for what you want? Do you relate to God as if He exists to further your selfish ambitions? Or are you convinced that you exist to glorify God? Do you covet esteem and crave for the approval of people around you? Or do you crave the approval of God? Do you go to great lengths to avoid looking foolish or being rejected for your Christian faith? Our small group leaders will have all these questions. I see a lot of people writing profusely. Our small group leaders will have these questions. Do you consider present and material results more important than your eternal reward? And if you're just being really honest with yourself, are you trying to live without God? You see, when we begin to evaluate and ask those tough questions, we begin to see what our heart is really going after. We begin to see what our heart is actually stirred for. Now, that's pretty heavy, isn't it? I don't know if any of us here are leaving like just, hey, George, man, great message today. Where are we going to go eat lunch? None of us are probably leaving here like maybe really encouraged because all of us are maybe getting a little called on the carpet. But you know what? This is not where the letter ends. This is not where the message of the church in Pergamum ends. Here's what it says. Verse 16. It says, therefore, repent. And it says this, it's pretty truthful. If not, I will come to you soon and war against them with the sword of my mouth. He who has ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, listen, to the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone with a new name written on the stone that no one knows except the one who receives it. So you know what he does to the church in Pergamum? This is the good news part. He says, hey, look, I know who you are. I know that you look good on the outside. I know that you're trying to have a really good reputation here. I know that you're trying to get your ego stroked by looking good and looking right, but your heart is far away from me. There's sin that has infiltrated you. You follow the teaching of Balaam, and you follow the teaching of the Nicolaitans, where there's things that you promote that I do not want you to promote. But listen to this. Now that I've challenged you in it, if you'll repent, then I'll have you again. Even in the middle of their rebellion, God's looking at them and He says, hey, just come on back. Come on back. I know the junk that's in your life. Get it right and come on back to me. You see, God's anger is always directed towards restoration. God's calling on the carpet is always directed at restoration of a relationship again. And so He says, hey, come back to me. If you don't, I'm going to do some things that I don't want to do. I'll judge with the sword. And I'll do it because I have to do it. He says, but if you come back to me, I will give you hidden manna, which means I'll have a deeper relationship with me. And then he says this, I will give you a white stone. And I'll put a name on it that only you know. That's a metaphor for the day that maybe we don't understand. But the white stone is actually an Olympic metaphor. In the early Olympic Games, the person that won their event was given a white stone to hang around their neck. And that white stone meant they were the best. They won. They finished the race at the front of the line. And so God says, Jesus says to the church in Pergamum, hey, I will put a white stone around your neck. And we'll be in good standing here. And so I guess the question that this text leads to is, hey, what's the thing in your life that if anyone found out about, you would be embarrassed? What's the sin that is crouching at your door? Where have you allowed the enemy to come in? Are you looking good on the outside, but yet the inside is far away from him? You see, some of us might be standing here today, but our heart is compromised. And what's scary about your heart being compromised is that Proverbs 4:23 says to guard it, because it's the wellspring of life. And so is your heart compromised? Have you allowed the enemy to come in and take your heart away from him, from the Lord? That's the question. That's what happened to the church in Pergamum. And I'll tell you, it can happen to us too. But the key is how we respond when called on the carpet. You see, my kids, they're all here today. And I tell them all the time, hey, they can manipulate me really easily. And I say that because not in a negative manipulation way, but I say that because if they would respond correctly with humility whenever they're called on the carpet, their punishment would be dramatically less than it normally is. Right. If I say to Hudson, go clean up your room, and he just mouths off to me, well, not only are you going to clean up the room, but there's going to be other consequences involved. Or, not only that, hey, when I tell Brooke, hey, Brooke, I need you to get off the computer, I need you to do this, if she responds in a yes, sir, or yes, ma'am to her mother, then you know what? It's going to go a lot better for her at our house. I'll give you an example. Actually, I won't. But I'm sorry. I looked at him and I realized I hadn't asked any permission for this. And I realized that, I just don't need. Oh, you giving me permission? Okay, so Brooke is giving it to me. So one day, Brooke is playing the Xbox, and I asked her to do something. And she's really embarrassed now. And she kind of mouths off to me, and we have a little moment, as a good father-daughter moment would have. And she takes the controller and she throws it on the ground. And that controller bursts into different pieces. Can't be fixed. And I said, Brooke, that's ridiculous. Why would you do that? She's like, well, I'm mad and I'm frustrated. I said, I get it, but here's your consequence. Anytime there are 4 people that are going to play, then you play the Xbox, and you're one of them, you're getting taken out until you choose to buy another Xbox controller with your money. So yesterday, my nephew and sister and brother-in-law come in, and there are 4 people that want to play the Xbox. And Hallie comes to me with this broken controller. I take that controller, and I go right over to Brooke. And I said, Brooke, are you playing the Xbox? Yeah. I said, well, Hallie wants to play. And she says, well, just give me a minute. And I just pulled out the broken controller. She hands her controller right to Hallie. I'm so proud of her in that. But Could you imagine if she would just responded in humility in the moment when I said, hey, go, Brooke, you need to do this. And she just put the controller down and did what she was supposed to do. I wouldn't have had to have that conversation with her yesterday. And I'll tell you that because God is often pictured and described as a good father. And when he calls us on the carpet, it's not to just push you down and to put his thumb on you. It's actually to bring you back to restoration. And so we can now respond in one of two ways. We can respond and say, God, you know what? You're so wrong. You have no idea what's going on. You don't know the pressures that you've put me under. Or you can respond in humility. And you can say, you know what, God? You're right. I've got to get this area right with my life. My prayer is that we wouldn't respond with a hard heart. That we would respond at a tough message like this in a way that restoration comes. Pray with me. God.